Hi, I'm Judy Farrell, and this is the Chai Sessions, my podcast for Merchant City Yoga, where I talk with yoga pals old and new, trying to understand better what it is we're doing when we practice yoga and why we do it. In this edition of the Chai Sessions, I'm talking to good friend and yoga philosophy maestro James Boag. He's a regular guest with me here on the Chai Sessions, and for many of you needs no introduction. But for anyone who hasn't met him yet, I first met James way back in 2011 when I was practising at what was then the Ashtanga Yoga Research Institute in Mysore, South India, and he was teaching yoga philosophy nearby. Originally from Yorkshire, James has a master's in Sanskrit. He works with the original Sanskrit texts and skillfully brings the timeless wisdom of these traditional scriptural teachings of yoga into the context of our modern lives. He's been teaching yoga since 2003 and leading programs on applied yoga philosophy around the world since 2009. Because we're chatting ahead of his next visit to MCY, when he'll be taking us on a deep dive into the Bhagavad Gita, I wanted to talk more about the Gita and what it might have for us as we live today. The Bhagavad Gita goes right back to the beginning of the time I've spent with James. The very first thing I wrote in my notebook from my first session with James in Mysore references the Gita. So I start by asking James, what is the Bhagavad Gita? And why does he believe it's still so relevant for us as modern yoga teachers and practitioners? No small question. And he says, because it is set here and now in the reality of our experience. James explains that the Gita is often considered to be the distillation of all the Upanishadic wisdom, a foundational text of the yoga method which provides practical wisdom on how we live skillfully in the world. Its setting on a battlefield represents the internal conflict we all find within us, and I think it's more relevant than ever in the uncertain and turbulent times we find ourselves in today. The process of change, the process of meeting and confronting our own limitations can be triggering and create resistance. And so the Gita is all about meeting that resistance in a skillful way, with its teachings offering us a way to reconnect with our inner voice and live more harmoniously in the world. We talk about many of the key themes of the Bhagavad Gita, including the difference between studying and studying about, the importance of direct personal experience and practical application in the yogic method of learning, meeting and transforming resistance, the importance of dialogue and conversation in human evolution, and acknowledging our own ignorance and embracing the unknown. James sums it all up when he says, the time on the mat or the meditation cushion is just preparation for the real practice of exploring these principles in day-to-day life. And that's where I find that the teachings of the Gita and the stories of the tradition, the mythology, the distilled teachings of the Yoga Sutra are such a practical help. I never run out of things to talk to James about, and this time is no exception. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. Hi, James. Thanks for joining me again.
Yeah, happy to see you.
Think we can safely say now you're a regular?
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. Definitely. Happy to be a regular. Yeah.
Good. So this time we are chatting ahead of your next visit to us here in Glasgow. And over that weekend, you're going to be taking a deep dive into the Bhagavad Gita. So I thought it would be a nice thing to chat about here and maybe chat about what it has for us, how it's still relevant. And I actually love that the Gita takes me right back to the very first time I met you, way back. So I'm sure lots of people have heard me tell the story now that we first met in Mysore in South India, and it was the 2nd of January 2012. And I know that's the day because look, I actually have my notebook here.
Oh, wow.
And this is my very first page from the very first session with you. And underneath the date and your name, what I've written references the Bhagavad Gita. So,
Oh,
like I say, the Gita takes us right back to that very
yeah.
first meeting. And just what I've written, right? Yoga everywhere, Gita, quotes in the midst, and then a little kind of arrow all around.
Uh-huh.
So that's what I've taken. That's what I've taken from what you're saying there. Um, so what I thought we'd start off with is what is the Bhagavad Gita, and what why rather do you think it's still relevant for us as modern teachers, modern practitioners in the yoga world today?
Okay, so those are two
Just
massive
a
questions.
little
Yeah.
question,
I'll, I'll
minute or
come,
two.
I'll just mention about addressing the second part of that question more directly first. So why is the Gita relevant? So the Gita famously is set on the battlefield, and the two sets of armies, the two factions, if you like, they are headed by relations, by cousins who grew up in the same field.
That's the next thing I've written down, James.
So basically, when I first encountered the Gita, I was a bit puzzled because I thought yoga's all about peace. Why is it on a battlefield? What's this got to do with yoga? And then I was very fortunate to attend a talk by the man who became my main teacher in my early years of yoga study. And as he explained that, these two sets of armies were cousins, they all grew up in the same territory, it became very obvious, these warring factions are different parts of the individual human psyche, the individual human being. And so why is the Gita relevant? Because it is set here now in the reality of our experience. And we find ourselves in the same situation that the student, Arjuna, in the Bhagavad Gita finds himself in any time and every time in life where we feel somewhat inadequate, where we feel somehow, I don't know what to do here. I can't see the clear way forwards. I could do that, but that doesn't feel right. I could do that, but that doesn't feel right. I don't know what to do. It's like we've lost connection to the cosmic intelligence or the clear pilot, the clear guidance of our inner GPS, our conscience, perhaps because of conditioned ideas or because of things, oh, I have to do this or I should do that or I must do that. And we don't feel sure about where we need to go, what we need to do. And I realize, I've taught the Gita now for quite some years, and only a couple of times have I ever met a human being who is not familiar with this situation of feeling torn or feeling not entirely clear about what is the right way forwards for me in this situation. And when we feel torn and fragmented, that's suboptimal in so many ways. Usually, we're not able to operate as freely, as happily, as efficiently, as effectively when we feel torn. What I've experienced myself is when I act from a place of fragmentation, often it doesn't work out very well. And I have to make reparations afterwards. Whereas, if I'm able to come to a place of clarity and integrity, where my heart and my guts, my bodily intelligence agrees with whatever is going on in my mind, if I act from that place, things flow much better. And even if things are challenging, I can work through it in a more joyful and a more nourishing way. And so the Gita is such a humane piece of scripture, such an amazing teaching because it recognizes it's kind of part of the human condition that as human beings, we lose sight of the tremendous intelligence that's actually available to us. It gets veiled and shrouded by all of our conditioned ideas. But there are reliable mechanisms to help us connect more reliably to that inner voice of conscience such that we can rehabilitate the connection to it and then move along the paths of life in a more congruent, cohesive way rather than find ourselves being led down so many different paths at once and feeling ourselves spread thin. So the Gita it's very thorough and it's very comprehensive. It's relatively condensed. I mean, it's sometimes considered to be the distillation of all of the Upanishadic wisdom. So the Upanishads are a section of the Vedic literature, the literature of the classic Indic and yogic tradition. And that section of the Vedic literature in the Upanishad is especially concerned with how to live skillfully in the world so that ultimately we might come to know who we really are. We might live freely here amidst all of the challenges and changes of human life. And the Upanishads range far and wide, and the Gita distills their practical wisdom. And it's in the form of a conversation between Arjuna, a sincere, striving student who wants to do what's best, and his teacher, who happens to be Krishna, who is considered to be totally connected to that cosmic intelligence because he's an avatar of that ultimate reality. So Krishna's connected to source intelligence, or whatever you want to call it, God consciousness, ultimate reality. But the way he expresses it in his life, very spontaneously, very freely, isn't impeded by all of the limits that flesh is ordinarily heir to. And so he's able to give Arjuna and give us very humane, practical teachings to how we can actually remember more of who we are and reclaim our real power, our real capacity. And one thing that's also so beautiful in the Gita, Krishna doesn't say, thou shalt not. There's no don'ts. It's always an encouragement. It's always an invitation. It's always an empowerment, the way the teachings are delivered. And it's in this form of a conversation. And so it invites us into conversation with the guru, the teacher of life, all the different experiences that we're having. So the other thing about why the Gita is so relevant is that, well, there's again hundreds of things one might say, but traditionally the Gita is given at what's regarded as the crack of the ages. So in the Indic vision of time, time moves through cycles. And this teaching was given when there was a shift from one cycle of time or one period of time to another, one age to another, the Dvapara Yuga to the Kali Yuga. So it was a time of tumult. It was a time of upheaval. It was a time of change. So I don't know about you or the people listening, but I mean, and we've had conversations over the 15 or so years we've known each other, Judy. Like, we were born in the 70s, and we've
Yeah.
experienced the 1970s. That is, for just to be precise. Uh,
Thanks
who
for clarifying.
who knows what latent powers us humans will be able to actualize and bring forth if we actually heed the invitation of this AI proliferation, which is potentially, one might say, ushering us towards recognitions that there is an intelligence that we are connected to that is beyond anything artificial. Of course, the artificial intelligence surpassed us long ago in computational power, but there are other types of intelligence that we have that we aren't really harnessing yet. We're not even tapping into.
Mhm.
Some people have experienced these things. Some people, like the great yogis of the tradition, they were able to do these things, to communicate telepathically. And this is a part of many indigenous cultures, telepathic communication. You don't need a mobile phone to be able to move through space in different ways, to be able to live a long time. There's many stories in the Indian tradition of rishis, sages who live lifespans that are not like the ordinary human lifespan. So anyway, who knows, in the future somebody might be watching this and night
To
which
think they've got out like a time
but anyway,
capsule or something.
yeah.
This
But
little
anyway,
antiquated thing called
yeah.
a podcast rather than just telepathic.
But anyway, being born in the 20th century in the 1970s, we've seen tremendous change, and this is actually, and it's a rather tumultuous time, but at the same time, is it not rather encouraging to recognize how quickly things can change? And this is a proof that things could change in miraculously beautiful ways really rather quickly if we move ourselves in ways that would facilitate that. So the Gita was given at a time of tumult and change. And
I think there's also something in it, James, that uncertainty and our response to uncertainty, it's perennial in a way, isn't it?
oh,
It's
yes.
it's not just new to
Yes.
us.
I mean, this is the thing
Might
of,
might have a different context, but
yeah. And I would suggest that the context of the battlefield is actually very realistic because the process of change, the process of meeting and confronting our own limitations, it's going to be triggering. It's going to create resistance. And so the Gita is all about meeting that resistance in a skillful way.
mm,
We might say transforming the cacophony of the battlefield into the harmony of a dance floor. So these opposing forces that seem like they're inimical, maybe we could meet that thing that seems like an enemy and transform it into an ally. Learn to dance with it, learn to transmute its energy so it can serve a greater harmony. And so this is the Gita is very pragmatic about this. Um, and just coming back to the initial part of the question about what is the Gita? So yes, it's a scriptural teaching. It's in the form of a conversation. It is considered one of the foundational teachings of the yoga method, of the yoga school or the yoga perspective, the yoga darshana, the yoga system, if you like. And so if a person is practicing yoga, if a person is exploring meditation or any type of yoga technique, asana, pranayama, for example, oftentimes people start doing some type of yoga technique and then we notice, it's having this significantly beneficial, positive impact in my life. I'm maybe a little bit less reactive. I notice I'm a bit more spacious in my responses. I notice I move my body in a slightly, let's say, more skillful way, for example, with more awareness. And sometimes this rouses the practitioner's curiosity. This yoga thing, yeah, there's something really magical, something powerful going on here. What's it all about? So the Gita is, along with the Yoga Sutra, one of the texts that is most, let's say, at the heart of the yoga tradition. They really distill the foundation principles of yoga. The Yoga Sutra does that for yoga, but the Gita does it not just for yoga, but for the, let's say, the bigger Indic perspective that yoga is the practical beating heart of. Um, so, I mean, I love this text, and like all the yoga texts, my one of my teachers who's now deceased, he I was studying the Gita with his son, and one day I go to the house, and his father, the now deceased amazing teacher, Lakshmitadacharya, he said, "This is a yoga book." And he said, the Bhagavad Gita was in my hands, and he took it, he says, "Good, you're studying this. This is a yoga book. What does it mean to be a yoga book? It's not like," and he mentioned a couple of books that have been published more recently. He said, "Those are not yoga books. A yoga book will be valid thousands of years after you're no longer here. Because yoga is about the perennial truths of navigating the human condition and life on earth. So this tradition and these teachings, they are perennial. So just as you suggested, Judy, the tumult, the challenge, the facing our fears and facing our dark side and recognizing that, I've actually been my own enemy. Actually, some of my habits, I'm getting in my own way. When we
you can
recognize,
catch me doing that, James. No.
yeah, when we recognize those things, it can be somewhat disheartening and it can sometimes be puzzling because we can, even once we apprehend it, we might notice, and I still do it even though I know it's not good for
Yeah.
me. How to deal with that? Well, Krishna, the teacher in the Gita, tells us how, and through his life shows us how. But the teachings are also encoded in this very beautiful and very empowering way. So the text is a conversation, but it really invites us into this attitude of dialogue and conversation. I mentioned the Gita is considered the distillation of the Upanishad. So Upanishad literally means to sit down near. So traditionally, when one studies in yoga, we study the text. It's called Shruti Parampara. Shruti means hearing, and Parampara from one to another. So the teacher's reciting the verses, then we're repeating the verses. We're starting to install their energy into the core of our being. And once they become lively within us, then we start to apply them in our own lives. We start to explore them in the arena of our own actions. And then these teachings start to come more and more alive. So the way the teaching is set out, it's really inviting and encouraging us to become an active participation in the conversation of human evolution. To recognize that I'm not here as just some passive consumer. I don't want to offend anybody or say something risque, but maybe I will. I don't know. But being a passive consumer is not really fully honoring the opportunity of a human birth. From the yogic perspective, when we're a human, we are co-creators. We have a creative capacity. We have a recreative capacity. Just because things have been the way they are up to a certain point doesn't mean they have to stay that way. So I think in modern society, there's a lot of influence that encourages us to be passive, just to accept the way things are. Yoga's like, no, no, no. Yoga begins
Mm.
when we actually own and acknowledge that the status quo, we are somehow implicit in it. And if we rouse ourselves and call forth our different energies and invite them to come into a kind of dynamic equilibrium, maybe we can actually create something different than we've experienced up to now.
Yeah. I think there's something in there, James, about, again, in our kind of modern culture, and just that piece about being in conversation, that yes, absolutely, we need to study and read and reflect and think, but actually it's in dialogue with other people who are trying to do the same things that we figure stuff out. And so there has to be space, going back to where you started here, to not know.
Yes.
So there has to be space to explore what you don't know and perhaps get it wrong. And
Hmm.
again, I think there's a kind of cultural thing here about, we all there's a pressure on us all to know what we're talking about and to have things sorted or nailed. I mean, perhaps especially as yoga teachers, like, we have all these amazing tools at our hands. Why are we not all, I don't know, where we want to be?
Are we
You
not
know,
in
floating, levitating or transcending or living our best lives, or whatever that is. So yeah, there's a couple of pieces in there about being in conversation and talking your experience through, and it being okay not to know, and seek out support and perhaps guidance from others. Like, for me, that's one of the, because before we came on, you said about my experience with the Gita. For me, that's one of the, I find it quite reassuring,
Yeah, and
actually.
to me, this is where when yoga begins. Like in the first
Mm.
word, of the Yoga Sutra is utta, and now I know that I do not know. Now I
I mean,
have admitted, acknowledged that I'm not in a state of yoga. I am ignorant. This is utterly foundational to the Indic perspective of the human condition. When we're a human, we are ignorant. We're subject to avidya. We cannot see the whole picture. So
yeah.
and until we acknowledge that, we can't really practice yoga in the true sense of the word, because yoga is the sincere, honest, heartfelt, continuous effort to look beyond our habitual ways of looking, to explore beyond the known. And going into the unknown can be a little bit intimidating. And when we go into the
Mm-hmm.
unknown, it's like we will stumble, we will fall down, we won't always get it right. We won't always do it in the most polished, refined way, but that's where the learning comes. So the idea in yoga is, yes, we're going to stumble. When we learned to walk, how many times did we fall over? Probably thousands. But we weren't keeping count. We were instead gathering in all of the useful information about what it actually means to put one foot in front of the other and be able to balance on 2 feet. And so we came to the point where we were able to maybe learn to walk and maybe even to dance and run and who knows what else. And in life, there's this strange affliction that has infected the modern world. We're supposed to have it all worked out. No,
Mm-hmm.
we're supposed to be students. From the yogic perspective, all of life is a learning. And it's so beautiful on the battlefield when Arjuna, the student, is there. He doesn't know what to do. He's this great mighty warrior, and then he's collapsed to the floor. His bow has dropped from his hand, his hair standing on end. This tremendous, wonderful, this great warrior, this hero who we've seen face all sorts of difficult situations before. This day, he doesn't know what to do. And there is an army, there's two armies with a total of 18 million soldiers all around him. And how does Krishna, the teacher, start teaching? Prahasan iva, smilingly, he starts to teach. So this is one of the other ideas in the Gita. It's like we need to acknowledge our not knowing what to do and be smiling about it. Take it in good humor. Not take ourselves too seriously, but can we see the funny side of our human stumblings? Because when we can laugh at ourselves stumbling, often that's a way to accelerate the learning. If I notice, oh, I'm getting in my own way, I'm in a self-sabotaging pattern, and then I get forlorn about it. I get, I've been self-sabotaging again, and then I get angry about it, or then I kind of I've been losing energy because of this self-sabotaging pattern. Now I apprehend the self-sabotaging pattern, and seeing it, I react with anger, and I'm just throwing away a lot of the energy that I could have reclaimed.
Yeah.
Whereas if I notice it and I have the presence to just kind of laugh at myself, then I can start to transmute that pattern, and it just starts to dissolve. So the way that Krishna gives the teachings is also very instructive.
But also in that as well, there's no judgment then from the teacher.
No, it's not about from Krishna is as a teacher is very pragmatic, and it's all about learning. He's constantly inviting us. And the other thing that happens in the Gita, Krishna gives oftentimes descriptions of a person who is established in yoga, but that at the same time is a type of prescription. It's an invitation to practice. If those are the qualities of a person who is more resilient, who is more centered, who is more robust, how could I conduct myself? What might I practice? What might I cultivate to help me be more steady, more centered? So, the way that the teachings are given, it really invites us to come to our own understandings. And I think this is part of the master psychology of the great yogic teachers. They recognize that, if somebody tells us something, we don't know it, we don't understand it. We only come to
No.
understanding when we actually make it our own, one way or another. But one way that can kind of fast track that making something of our own is being presented it in a way that we can kind of process, we can grab onto it through our own intelligence rather than it be just kind of implanted into us. So if, for example, I had a beautiful experience as a young boy, one of my neighbors, he was this beautiful practicing Christian, a man who really embodied Christian virtue. He was like a wonderful neighbor, a kind human being. But I did something that he thought maybe wasn't the best way to behave. But he didn't chastise me. He just asked me about why I was doing what I was doing in a kind of gentle but authoritative way. And he invited me to think about it. And then I came to my own
Right.
recognition. So Krishna's a little bit like that. Like he knows, but he doesn't, he knows that we have to come to our own knowing. So he doesn't, there's no, you don't have to believe anything. You don't have to, it doesn't tell Arjuna, you must do this. He basically says you need to just tune into your common sense, your conscience, and then do what you think is best. And then, good luck to you. It's like, uh,
Mm. Yeah. I mean, I think just what you're saying there talks to something else I see in the world today. Like there's so much information. Like
yes,
and in the world of yoga as well, there's so more information than there's ever been before. But if we simply consume information, that's not the same as knowing or
yes,
experiencing.
yeah,
And actually we don't necessarily need that much information, but what we need to be doing with that is working with it.
yes. Yeah, Krishna is very overt about this in the Gita. He says, for example, he says, all of the Vedas, all of these textual, scriptural teachings, they're as much use as the amount of water you can fit in your cupped hands for the person who's actually established who knows ultimate reality. Now, there's so much you can unpack in that teaching, but the idea is like the teachings are intended, the teachings that are encoded in scripture, in texts, they're intended to help us come to an understanding that is beyond what could ever be described with words. So it's also very striking in the yoga method, in the old tradition, in the Yoga Sutra, for example, at the very beginning of the text, Patanjali lays out what are called the pramanas. So pramana means how we come to know something, the means of valid knowledge. And yoga uses three, accepts three. First is what's called in Sanskrit pratyaksha. It means direct perception, direct personal experience through one's own powers, of one's own senses, one's own lived experience. That's the first method. Yoga being pragmatic, Patanjali tells ultimately when it comes to deeper experiences of yoga, pratyaksha, direct experience, is the only method that is valid. But along the way, we can also work with anumana, which means inference. For example, I look at the mountain and I see smoke, and I can infer there's a fire on the mountain. I have the direct perception, the pratyaksha of the smoke, which allows me to infer the presence of the fire because fire and smoke are universally concomitant. They always go together, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And yoga also acknowledges and admits the validity of agama, which means that which has come. So it's like reliable testimony. Now, somebody says, is there any testimony that's really reliable? So again, Patanjali says, when it comes to the ultimate experiences of yoga, the subtler realms of potential human experience, you have to have those experiences for yourself. But along the way, let's say, Judy, let's say I come to Scotland and there's an MCY excursion to do a Ben. Yeah, we're going to do a Munro walk, and maybe there's one with some craggy peaks. And let's say you're leading the party, and there's a like a corner on the like we go around a bend on some cliff path, and it's a really narrow ridge. And there you are leading us, and you go, "Hey, everybody, take care when you come around this rock. It's really precarious and it's slippery. So keep your feet on the path. The view's amazing, but keep your feet on the path." You've already had the pratyaksha, you've already had the direct experience yourself, and you're relaying that
Yeah.
information to us in a form that is useful, that can help us then navigate that similar situation with greater preparation or skillfulness. So this is the idea of a text. It's not going to give us the real knowing, but it can invite us to come to that knowing, to be able to enjoy the view without falling into the view, because we took care to put our feet on the solid ground so we can enjoy the dramatic,
Yeah.
around us, for example. But look
And
at
it's not intended to replace your experience either. Me giving you
no,
information isn't intended to replace your own
no, and
experience.
notice also that that agama, that testimony, comes from the person who had it, who gave it, having the direct experience themselves.
Yeah.
So I mention this just to highlight the idea that in the yogic method of learning, everything proceeds from experiential understanding. It's not studying about, it's actually studying. So if we use these English words, people think studying means reading about stuff or hearing about things,
Yeah. Yeah.
attending a lecture, maybe writing a report because you've read 6 different books about it. That's not studying in the yogic method. If we translate the Sanskrit word to study, that's not what it means. It means to practice it in one's living, breathing, embodied experience. So in the Sanskrit tradition, there's a huge difference between studying and studying about. So one time I was teaching in Israel more than 10 years ago, and a lovely gentleman who taught Sanskrit at a university there came to the session. He said, "James, I have this problem. I cannot teach Sanskrit. I can only teach about Sanskrit, because the Western Academy does not even admit the type of study or learning experience that is totally intrinsic to the Sanskrit learning method." So yoga doesn't mean to study yoga doesn't mean to read a nice book about it. It means if I'm working with a book or a text, or I'm listening to some talk, whatever it might be, I'm working with that and applying it in my own conversation, to my own relationship to myself, to the people and the environment around me. And then it becomes study in the yogic sense. It's an embodied, practiced, practical study. So when we gather and do a weekend on the Gita, it's not that we're going to just, oh, look into the curiosity of the text, because it's a fascinating text. One could spend one's time doing that. One could even write a translation from that perspective. And there are many translations that are the products of a scholarly approach.
Yeah.
But that's not part of the tradition. The tradition is a practical tradition. And the great teachers in the yoga tradition, some of them have tremendous capacity to communicate these teachings in verbal forms, but it all proceeds from their pratyaksha, from their direct experience. And so Krishna in the Gita, just like Patanjali in the Yoga Sutra, they are teaching from the position of knowing, not knowing intellectually, knowing totally. That knowledge pulsates in their very selves. And to study the Gita, this is what my teacher again said to me. He says, when you with that book, yeah, like here's the book, this book that is going to be valid in thousands of years' time. To study this, you should be able to give the book away because you've installed it into the heart of every cell in your being. So you can call on its practical teachings when they are of practical use. So this is learning by heart in the Indic tradition. It doesn't mean learn by rote. It means install the teachings into the pulsing heart of your being, the pulsing heart of your being that is participating in the evolution of life. So the teaching can inform me one way today and maybe in a different way tomorrow or next year because it's alive. And this is another beautiful thing in the Yoga Sutra and in the Bhagavad Gita. The teachings always work from gross to subtle, and they always invite us to work from gross to subtle. So here I am today, and I'm exploring the teachings in these ways. But as I keep exploring, they may continue to open up and reveal more. And as I go deeper on my own yogic journey, a journey towards greater wholeness, a journey of healing in a certain context, or peeling back the veils of ignorance so I can see a little bit more than before. When I see a little bit more than before, I might sometimes come to revelations. Oh no, I've been getting in my own way in that way too.
No.
And then the teaching can give me support and guidance and good-humored encouragement as I do the next layer of harmonization work.
Yeah, it's definitely learning in layers, isn't it? And every time you visit, you see something new or see it in a slightly different way.
Yeah, and I think, this is one of the ideas about as a practice in the yoga tradition, in the Indic tradition more broadly, for the human being, it is part of our duty to enjoy life. Sometimes people have this misperception that yoga is about denial and asceticism. The thing is, yoga is very inclusive. So for some people, living in the mountains wearing one piece of cloth and eating a few sprouts, they're thriving on that regime. For other people, that would be torture. That's not a way to move towards greater understanding. Yoga is very inclusive. So there's so many different approaches that can help us in our own unique configuration of being a human. But if we are learning and growing, it has this kind of uplifting, inspiring effect. If we can learn to be a lifelong apprentice at this game of life, then we can find a lot of joy in laughing at our own foibles and maybe learning a little bit more along the way. And so yoga recognizes life is a pulsating, cycling experience. As we learn to work with those cycles, there's the idea that we can actually harness the lifelong opportunity to keep learning and find joy in that process. So if we're making this effort to foster steadiness, that's one way that yoga practices describe the effort to foster steadiness and clarity. when we're making the effort to foster steadiness and clarity, sometimes, perhaps fairly frequently, we're going to notice where we have been harboring tendencies that create the opposite of clarity and steadiness, that make us shaky, that make us unsteady, or that kind of veil our awareness or muddy our perceptions. When we come to those recognitions, it can sometimes feel a little bit frustrating. But what yoga offers us is a method to transform what could have been a struggle into a kind of almost like a celebration, into a process that's actually very nourishing and is its own self-propelling validation. Um,
Does, does that talk then a little bit to, one of the other themes in the Gita as well, which is a standout one for me, is the idea of, you know, work or service for the sake of doing the work or doing the service, and less so about the outcome.
yeah, this is one of the most foundational teachings in the Gita that's really given a lot of emphasis, particularly in the
It's
opening
quite
section.
tricky when you try and actually do it, though, isn't it? It
So,
sounds really nice and reassuring when you say it and you're like, oh yeah, that's yeah, yeah. But see when you actually try and do it.
well, this is also where if one has a yoga practice of any description, this is where that can be really harnessed for the sake of deepening one's understanding of that principle. So making the action its own reward. So Krishna is very clear. Pitiable are those whose motivation is the fruit or outcome of the actions, because
He's got quite the turn of phrase, doesn't he?
yeah, I mean it's even better in the Sanskrit, it's like, but he says, one should, yeah, he says, you've got to, it's too bad for that. If you have that attitude, you're basically sentencing yourself to disappointment.
Doomed.
We have control over the outcomes. But we do have authority or jurisdiction or some degree of influence over how we do what we do, over how we meet life. And so, what Krishna advocates is make the action its own reward. This is one of the topics that we'll certainly take
Mm,
up in the weekend and explore in lots of practical ways. But one way, for example, is that when we are embodied, this body requires maintenance. It has many great powers, and yoga invites us to treat these powers with respect. If we treat the bodily powers with respect, then they will serve us beautifully. If we neglect them, then they may run amok. They may run out of balance in ways that um, leak or waste energy, that create inefficiency in our experience. But we have to act. As long as we're alive, action's inevitable. So if something's inevitable from the perspective of Krishna, do it skillfully. Do it in a way that doesn't make things harder than they need to be.
yes.
So if we want to practice making the action its own reward, one very useful layer or area to practice that in is in those simple day-to-day maintenance things. If you live in a house, maybe you have to clean the house. But instead of it being a thing of drudgery, can you make it almost like a celebration? You use it as an opportunity to give thanks for your capacity to actually move your body, to be able to perceive the dust or the spillage on the kitchen floor, whatever it might be. And similarly, with another idea that is linked is this idea of offering one's action or dedicating one's action to something beyond the known, to something higher. So if one is of devotional persuasion, this can make it easier to kind of, I'm channeling my action for the sake of something more. But to give a kind of mundane example, if say, for example, I've got to clean the house, But if my best, like my very, very dear friend who I've not seen for a long time is going to come and visit, then I might joyfully clean the house because I want them to be able to come and find a place that feels like a sanctuary. So as I'm cleaning the house for their arrival, I'm doing it with joy, anticipating seeing my beloved friend, but I'm also doing it gladly to be of service so they can enjoy their landing into this place I'm welcoming them into, for example. And then similarly, simple things that we have to do, like for example, um, we need to drink water. Sometimes people talk about aqua vita, the water of life. So earth, water, fire, air, and space. These are all part of our experience all the time. When I drink water, how do I drink water? Do I just drink water? Or can I make the act of drinking the water an act like a kind of prayer of gratitude? Like when I drink the water, I'm thankful for the water that gives me life, that cleanses me, that nourishes me. I enter into a different relationship with the building blocks of existence. So as I drink the water, this helps me drink it with more awareness. And as I start to bring more awareness into my actions, into my habits, it makes it much easier for me to not do things in an autopilot, self-sabotaging way because I start to notice more the quality with which I'm doing my actions. So when I start to do things as an act of service, as an act of celebration, as an act of gratitude, if I develop that habit, then doing something in a kind of absent-minded, careless, or disrespectful way will kind of jar because I've got used to the frequency of doing things with respectfulness, with gratitude. So if I do, let's say somebody likes to do a yoga asana practice, make that asana practice an embodied prayer of gratitude and notice what happens in the rest of the day. It's like, why do I do asana in the morning? Because I want to set myself up to enjoy the day and live it in a more steady, sukham, easeful way.
Yeah.
I mean, someone say, "Oh, I'm doing asana because I want to look slimmer or I want to feel more energy." Yeah, but why do you want to feel more energy? You want to feel better. Yeah. So how do you want to feel better? If you want to feel better, we've got to, well, who am I to say we've got to do? But it can be very helpful to invite all parts of ourselves into that play, into that process. Because if I just focus on one part of life and I neglect the others, it's not going to be very long before those neglected parts kick up a fuss. And if they don't, they'll protest in some way. They need also to be respected. So the idea of skillfulness in action is totally intrinsic to the yogic method. It's ultra pragmatic. It's some people use the word like spirituality. Now, for me, there's no such thing as a living being that's not spiritual. Spirit is the breath of life, the breath
Mm.
of existence itself. But it's practical, embodied spirituality. It's recognizing that whenever you do anything, you are using spirit, you're using energy. So, how do you want to use energy? Would you like to have an energy surplus, which means that you can kind of move through life with a feeling of enoughness? Or do you want to just drain your energy so life always feels like a struggle? The reality is that as long as we're alive, we have energy moving through us. How do we want to be a custodian of this energy? How do we want to channel it? What do we actually want to do with this gift of a human birth? And the Bhagavad Gita is a time-proven distillation of a practical method to deploy the gifts of human energy and human consciousness in ways that move away from conflict and towards greater peacefulness, away from fragmentation towards greater unity and harmony. And I would like more harmony and more unity in myself
And
and in my surroundings. So the
yeah,
Gita,
heaven knows we could think the world could do with more of that too
and Krishna is very
just
practical.
now.
Start where you are, start with you. And it's
Yeah.
always very empowering. So, um, yeah, I mean,
I think that's a yeah, that perfect, beautiful place to wrap up. As always, I'm conscious of time and we could talk on for ages, but I just want you to know that every time I am cleaning the studio floor after class, I have you in my mind telling the story of cleaning the sand off that apartment in Mysore where I first met you at that first yoga session.
yeah.
In my mind every time.
Yeah, and it's it was that this morning. I'm in England right now, and I'm staying in the house of a person who's not very well. So there's some things that are neglected. So there's things to take care of. And so this morning I chose to clean the house with
Yeah.
gladness. And
Yeah.
if I'd cleaned the house with resentment, I just I'm just inviting suffering. If I clean that,
Yeah.
and the vacuum cleaner broke. So now I'm
Of
gonna,
course it did.
but it's like, oh, good humoredly, I like, oh yeah, it's broken right now. So now I know I get, it's like this is a work in progress for me. Now I'm very pleased that I managed to make the choice or to respond in a way that didn't engender unnecessary suffering.
Yeah. And I know we're having a laugh about it, but actually that's where it is, isn't it? It's like right right at the cold front, I feel like, of our
Definitely.
day-to-day life,
Like, classic
the
example.
mundane.
Somebody goes to yoga asana class or in the morning does their practice, whatever, and feels great. And then goes out, and that's stoked the energy. Because this is one thing that with yoga practices, we are actually inculcating energy surplus. So we're going to have more Shakti, more power, more capacity, more energy at our disposal from our practices. Let's say we then step out into the world and, you know, somebody does something on the road that we don't like, or the family member or the colleague does something that pushes a button. And in a wrathful reaction, we spew out, we just we just threw away that energy surplus. You know, like in the Ashtanga, they talk
And
about the first series is called Yoga Chikitsa. Chikitsa means medicine. If our lifestyle and the way that we conduct ourselves the rest of the day is not conducive to yoga, we will never get the yoga. We'll only be doing chikitsa every day.
yeah,
But the idea is we do that cleansing so we can actually foster more yoga and then move into the day, the rest of the day in a way that takes the healing further and allows us to move through our interactions in a way that deepens the experience of yoga. So when we go back to technique, it can actually go deeper and subtler, and that process can continue. So that's where it really all happens. That's the yoga practice. The time on the mat or the meditation cushion is that's just preparation for the real practice of exploring these principles in day-to-day life. And that's where I find that the teachings of the Gita and the stories of the tradition, the mythology,
mm,
and then the distilled teachings of the Yoga Sutra, they're such a practical help because if I take a bit of time to familiarize myself with them and some of the images, some of the stories, some of the frames of reference, then when I'm about to, or if I catch myself doing something that is engendering unnecessary suffering, I say, I've fallen into that old trap. And then I can see it and respond and maybe come back to center more quickly than I might have done in the past, or maybe even avoid it in the instant. Oh, wait a minute, this is about to happen. No, I'm not going to do that anymore. Um, and so practice, I mentioned already the idea of like study means to practice, but practice also means to study. They're two wings of the same bird in the tradition. So taking the time to soak in the teaching so they become part of our awareness, part of our frame of reference, does make it, at least this is my experience, I know it is for many other people as well. It just helps us in that day-to-day ongoing real life practice.
yeah. And we are going to stop talking, but but that just brings to mind one of the other things that you've said any number of times over the years as well, is that even noticing means your practice is working.
Yes.
It's doing something, even if you didn't catch yourself, even if you've done the same thing again, having noticed it, hopefully you'll notice a little bit sooner the next
Exactly.
time. And it means like the whole thing is I'm going to say working,
Yeah.
whatever that
Yeah.
means.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, James, can't wait to see you
Yeah. No, I'm looking forward to
in
hopefully,
the flesh.
and who knows what will come through. And every time we dive into these texts, and whoever's in the room, it's a co-creation together.
Yeah, it's different, isn't it? Every single time.
As we enter into dialogue with the text, um, it's always going to show us something fresh. So very pleased to be coming to share in Glasgow again.
James, thank you so much.
Thank you, Julie.
Until next time.
Yes. Okay. Bye for now.
I'm chatting to James ahead of his next visit to Merchant City Yoga, the 28th to the 30th of March 2025, when he'll be taking us on a deep dive into the Bhagavad Gita and showing how it's really about each of us and gives us a manual for being human. You'll find all the details and booking on the workshops page of the website merchantcityyoga.com. As always, these conversations are unedited, but I'd like to shout out Steph Northcote for smoothing out the wrinkles at the beginning and end of every episode. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends. Please follow, rate and review to help other people find us too. Until next time, thanks so much for listening.